Hello, everyone. It is my pleasure to welcome you all to the second day of our KIX EMAP Skill Strengthening Workshop on Qualitative Research, which is conducted in partnership with the Building Evidence in Education Network, BE Squared. It is great to see you all here for the second day. I hope you enjoyed our first day yesterday. It was a very interactive session. We're really happy to hear your different comments, questions in the chat, also to have the great discussions we've had in breakout rooms. So we hope to keep that same level of energy interaction in today's session, and hope that we can also clarify some of the pending questions that were there from yesterday. And just a reminder, 4 hours or 2 hours yesterday, and these 2 hours that we are having today seems a lot, but it's actually a short time for the amount of things we could be covering under this topic of qualitative research. So we welcome you to think of this as a departing point. And at the end of the workshop, we'll also share with you a survey in which we would be happy to hear from you, of course, your feedback, but also how you would like to explore further this topic. So keep it in mind that this can be also the start of a journey, and let us know your preferences in continuing to explore this topic. So without further ado, let me hand the floor to Deborah Gribon from BE Squared, who will start the workshop for us today. Deborah.
Great. Thank you so much, Marina. And thank you to all of you who are back today for day 2. We're very excited to get started. As you know, yesterday, we focused on getting the front end of the process right, taking an issue and turning it into a strong qualitative research question, and then lining that up with the methodology, the methods, the sampling. Today, we're going to do the latter part of that, thinking about analysis of qualitative data, how you check quality, how you use findings. So just to preview here our agenda for the day, we'll start by doing a quick recap, and then we'll share a few ideas from the homework. Then we'll dig into analysis and how that links to purpose and use. We'll have one breakout that's based on the case study, and then we'll come back to talk about applying findings in decision making. We'll talk about common pitfalls, and at the very end, we'll talk about how software fits in. So before we jump into all of that, though, we did want to take a moment just to hear from you all about how you're thinking about using qualitative research in your work. So I'm going to call on a volunteer in just a moment, but we've already had someone step up to speak for just a few seconds, a minute or so, about your experience. Nisa Felicia, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, is the Indonesian National Coordinator for KIX. So Nisa, would you mind coming off of mute and sharing a little bit about your experience?
Hi, thank you, Deborah. Good evening, everyone. It's 7 p.m. here in Jakarta. Nice to meet you all. I saw some colleagues from Indonesia as well. So yeah, I'm working in an NGO. It's a local NGO working in the area of education policy advocacy. So to share about the qualitative evidence in the field of education policy in Indonesia, yesterday I mentioned on the comment section actually that sometimes qualitative study, especially when we talk about mixed method, the qualitative study is often as a complementary, the purpose is only to complement the quantitative findings. So when the quantitative findings is presented and some explanations are needed, so that's where the qualitative study will be conducted. But actually, if you ask me personally, I think it should be more than just to verify or just for the purpose of triangulation. But I think it has to be more explaining about the nuance, it should explain in what context or in which context, in which circumstances a policy worked that way and how it would be different in a different context. So it should not be just for justify the findings, the quantitative finding especially. And meanwhile, in another education issues, I believe that based on my experience right now working with UNESCO Indonesia on the school-related gender-based violence, qualitative findings and qualitative study is way more informative for us to understand about the SRGBV issues in schools, because data on violence is not something that easily quantified, and we understand the principle is that one is already too many. So qualitative is becomes very important approach to use in some policy areas like SRGBV. I think that's all. I don't want to take too much time.
Thank you so much, Nisa. That was very helpful. We would love to have one other person, one brave soul, come off of mute and share about their experience as well. Yes, Akram. I believe I see your hand raised. Do you want to come off of mute?
I don't know.
We can hear you well, Akram.
You can hear me well right now. Thank you. Just I want to share my my experience using the qualitative approach. Specifically when you check the root causes of such phenomena. For example, the dropout of the schools. You cannot just rely on the quantitative part. And for example, in our country, that one of the reason behind the scene, the root causes like the issue of the early and enforced marriage for the females. So I did use this qualitative approach specifically as a multi-stage approach. It's a mixed method, multi-stage. So I did first the quantitative part, and then based on the quantitative part, go to after reviewing analyzing the quantitative data, then I go to the next stage, which is combine the qualitative data. And even I base the development of the tools based on the process of this analysis. I use the analytical framework of the quantitative data to inform the development of the tools, just to read the behind the scene and also to dig deep on the root causes of such phenomena. So based on my experience, that we have many issues are related and correlated to the education. They cannot be even determined or just you cannot even analyze them without using this technique of the qualitative approach. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Very helpful, Nisa and Akram. Very, very helpful. I see Rasha and maybe some others have put some examples in the chat. So keep using the chat. That's a great way to engage as well. So now we're going to move into a quick recap of yesterday. I'll kick us off and then hand it over to Joan. So just a couple points here first on research questions and methodology. So sometimes I hear people having this conversation about qualitative versus quantitative, as if the two are competing with one another. And we would say that's maybe the starting point. The research question and the purpose drive the choice of methodology and methods, and whether or not you want to use a qualitative approach, a quantitative approach, or mixed methods. Qualitative research is especially useful when we need to understand context and conditions, and when we need to explain how different factors and conditions are producing the outcomes that we're seeing. Joan, over to you.
Thank you, everyone, and good morning, good afternoon, or good evening. It's so nice to join you all again, and thanks for those wonderful examples of using qualitative research. I want to briefly recap around the what uses of methods, right? We talked yesterday about various approaches we can use, like case studies and ethnography, grounded theory, etc. But that methods can be used across all of these approaches, right? And I think the important thing here to keep in mind is, again, that purpose drives methods. So if we're trying to do a comparative case study, for example, and we want to be understanding unique differences and similarities between cases, like we've looked at in case one, it might be more important to use a more structured kind of method. So structured observation, as you saw in that case study, or structured interviews. But we can also use more semi-structured or unstructured depending on the purpose. And I think there was just the example of looking at, for example, gender-based violence in schools. And if you don't have a whole lot of data about it, or if you know that that takes on various forms because of the different people you might be talking to, boys and girls, or different in different maybe ethnic or racial groups of your society, you might decide to do something more unstructured or semi-structured to try and follow the kind of very specific new findings that you are learning. So that's important to keep in mind whether we do interviews or observations, is there can be a range from structured to unstructured. Again, depending on the purpose. If you're looking at classrooms, you may want more structured observation. If you know you're honing in on a very specific learning kind of pedagogy. But you might use more unstructured if you're attending meetings, if you're looking for trying to understand how administrators are doing something. So that I think is just, again, thinking about our methods and ways that we can use them across different approaches. Let's move briefly to recapping sampling. We talked yesterday about different kinds of sampling, but I think the important thing in qualitative to keep in mind is that we are purposeful, right, in our sampling and qualitative. You might still at some points do some random, right, especially if it's tied to a mixed method study. There was an example of that, I guess, in the case one again, where there was that, I should note, was actually tied to some prior RCT, randomized control trial work, that had been done in various districts across Bihar. So then they wanted to purposefully and somewhat random sample different districts in that case. But we are selecting participants because of useful data they will generate, but you don't want to bias that purposeful sampling, right? You don't want to just seek certain kinds of perspectives in doing that. So that's where things like maximum variation and clustered sampling can also be really useful, because then you're not really leaning into a particular set or group of people. And I think you saw that actually in case two yesterday, because they identified different levels of society that they were like, so religious organizations or other organizations that they were going to sample from, and then they clustered their sampling in those particular groups in society. And again, sample size is not the only thing we focus on and shouldn't be what we focus on necessarily, and think about it as representativeness, but rather we're focusing on the kind of data that we do get and the richness of that and the ways that it can confirm and disconfirm certain hypotheses, if you will, certain assumptions we are trying to understand. Right, let's move to the next slide. And then briefly to recap a bit about doing rapid studies, right? You have all talked about different kinds of studies you've done. You shared some examples and questions yesterday about doing various kinds of studies. And sometimes those studies are going to be longer term in the field. Sometimes they're going to be rapid, or we're going to try and do them more quickly. And usually the scope is somehow affected under rapid studies. But it could also be the method. We, I think, are lucky today with both technology and AI that one could increase the speed by which data is gathered. Now, one has to be careful in doing that so that you don't, that you account for enough rigor in your decision making around selection or use of your methods. But we can get information out very quickly now through phones, through ways that can be used with photos, right, through phones or other technologies, and gather that data also much quicker. So think about your adaptation of methods as much as you might even your scope when thinking about rapid studies. And of course, not to forget about some of the rigor you want in that rapid study by trying to do some more iterative sampling or gathering of data so that you can actually confirm and disconfirm some of the things you're looking at. All right, I think we want to take some time to move to our homework. You discussed the two cases yesterday, and we asked you to think about alternatives for these cases. What kind of alternative questions? Now, if you're thinking about alternative questions, there might be another purpose to those that you're actually adding to that case. But what other alternative methods and sampling would you use? And I'd like for you now to just put in the chat at least an example from each group. So if you could identify your group and the case. So we would want to see some examples from case 1 and case 2 to say what group you were in, which case, and maybe an alternative method, alternative sample that you would use. You can take a minute or so to put that in the chat. We'll take a look at what you're saying and try to talk through that. Okay, I see the use of focus group and purposive sampling. Could we get a couple examples from case 1? What alternatives would you think about? Okay. So potentially adding some observation to actually include the grades and the participants, the students. So in case 1, there was observation of the leaders or management of the reform in the schools and in the districts. Okay, phenomenological. Okay, I like this. Thinking about being more participatory or some more maximum variation in our sampling. All right, so thinking about maybe maximum variation across both not only participants, but cases we identify to try and identify succeeding kinds of examples rather than failure in scale up. And that's, I think, a really critical point. We sometimes need to look at what does succeed, and it might actually be some successes even in any given case as well to identify. Well, thank you for those examples of alternatives we could consider for those cases, recognizing that when we add certain methods or sampling, we might also be adding to the questions we're asking, right? So for example, if we are adding the sampling and methods with the students in case 1, where we're looking at the implementation of a reform that affects the learning of students, we might be looking more at the outcomes of them. And I should say that in that case, in any case, they did measure the outcomes of the students with some quantitative data. So that's a really good example to talk about. Someone brought up yesterday mixed methods. And I think case 1 is a really good example to think about where and how mixed methods are used. Now, in the case, we mostly talk about the qualitative methods and the rich qualitative methods of observation and interview. But there were also quantitative data gathered on the learning outcomes. All right. Thank you. So we will move to discussing more now about those cases and how we can analyze the data from those different methods and the data that's gathered. And so I think let's move to our next slide. And again, what we've been talking about the whole time with when we design studies is the linking of our purpose, right, to what we're doing. So again, in analysis, we're thinking about what is our purpose? What are we asking? What are our research questions? And when we ask those research questions, we're analyzing according to those questions. And sometimes we may have asked the question a little differently initially, and we realize that with all the data, we can ask it a little differently. Maybe the comparative aspect of a question wasn't as evident, for example. In case one, it was very much designed to be. In case two, it wasn't necessarily designed to be, but you could potentially or add to that research question and be more comparative by trying to compare not only the different schools in case one, but in case two, trying to compare kind of maybe the differences between different kinds of stakeholders because there might be different outcomes and implications for the implementation of the policy. Remember that analysis also begins during data gathering. So as we gather data, especially if we are observing, right? When we're interviewing, when we're reviewing maybe photos that we gathered, and someone shared a nice example in the chat of how they used photos to examine nutrition in school meals. We are trying to look at those as we're gathering, and in some ways we're trying to already test our assumptions and see where the evidence is confirming or not, because we need to say, do we have enough information here to affirm? And we're not only seeking to affirm, we also want to make sure we are looking for disconfirming evidence. And finally, in analysis, as I said, we're often making comparisons and we're seeking explanation. So we're not just seeking, as Nisa said, to confirm some other quantitative data that might have been gathered, but we might actually be seeking new explanations to the why and how that we might not be able to explain through quantitative data. So again, we might be doing standalone qualitative studies, or we might be using our qualitative studies with mixed methods, but not always just for the sake of confirmation, but to actually add new knowledge to those. So some other analysis features that these are very common ways for us to think about analysis broadly, right? Depending on and then we'll talk more about how we can go about analysis. One, we're looking for patterns, obviously, similarities, but I often have to work with my graduate students, or when I'm working on research teams with ministries and others, that we're also looking for differences. It isn't just similarities. We're making comparisons at different levels, right, between individuals or groups or cases. We are seeking to explain outcomes and offer alternative hypotheses and look for these disconfirming cases. There was an example in the chat of how we could explain some positive elements of how the reform worked in Bihar. And maybe there are positive elements even within a particular district or school, even while we focus on some things that didn't go well with the reform. And finally, we want to be thinking about how our data relate to our conceptual framework or our theories of change, or quantitative findings that we might have, to not just, as we said, confirm, but to negate or even propose new ideas. Next slide. So I want to talk through now the different kinds of analysis that were used in the two case studies. You will get some time in breakout groups to discuss actually how they went about the analysis and whether you think the analysis actually answered the question, not just supported it, right? But answered questions or even went beyond. But each of these examples actually use two different kinds of qualitative analysis. In the first case, the policy implementation case in Bihar, we have first the use of multiple methods, right? So we have the method of interviews with teachers, with leaders, so with the district leaders, but also with the administrators in the school. And they did what they called an observation time use study, which was a very, I think, structured observation where they followed, right, the administrators around and documented how they used their time in relation to the implementation of the reform. This was in some ways also to sort of add and make the data more robust, right? It's a way for seeking more trustworthiness in the data, because you might have teachers or principals telling us one thing about what they're doing, But then if you observe what they're doing, you'll be able to see where that shows that where their maybe their statements, their values, their beliefs about what they're doing show up actually in their actions. And it's not that people are necessarily not trying to do what they say. It's simply that in our daily life, we don't always do what we say, right? So I think using something in addition to interview, as we talked about yesterday, is really an important thing to address sort of the trustworthiness of data. And so that's what they did in this first is they took those multiple methods and they tried to compare them for the different administrators and teachers to offer an account of how governance was happening with the reform. And then they did the case comparison and they looked at what was happening in one district, in schools in one district versus a different district, because the way that they rolled out in the different districts was different. Even if we intend a reform to roll out similarly, we, and through qualitative research, can uncover the mechanisms by which they roll out differently. So one might be that they intended to do 2 hours or about 2 hours of teaching in this new method, but it could be that they didn't do it. And in fact, they found that in one district, they never got the materials in time. So they never used the right materials. So it's that kind of qualitative evidence that helps us see some of the details between different cases. Now, we can use quantitative evidence or quantitative surveys to look at fidelity, right? Fidelity of implementation. But some of those details around fidelity don't get revealed through surveys. So think about how we can combine certain kind of quantitative questions for fidelity with qualitative questions that show us things that we weren't expecting or things that people don't necessarily want to tell us. In the second case, we again have two sort of types of qualitative analysis. The first is a very common one we might see, and I see this a lot when I see interviews being used. In this case, primarily revolved around different sets of interviews. But we see what's called content analysis. So coding the data initially, trying to look for what were the different kinds of themes that were emerging around resistance, if you will, or support for comprehensive sexuality education. But they didn't just code it, right? They also used a second researcher to check that coding. So ways for trying to ensure the trustworthiness of how you go about coding data, because we might have disagreements about how we understand different people's sort of statements, right? And so then they used what they call the mutual consent way to try to then summarize what they mean by the different codes and then begin to categorize them. But I think interestingly, then there was like, how do we make sense of all these codes, right? And they used a method that they called network analysis in their data software. In this case, it was MaxQDA. But you can also do this in Vivo or other softwares. And they used a method where they try to look at the code overlaps in the content, right? So not just in quantitative ways, but in the content of how one code from, say, religious leaders was related to something else, or how codes from parents were related to some other idea. And with that, they came up with what they called these nodes between, say, NGOs and their misconceptions, or parents and their misconceptions, or resources to come up with a set of findings. So I don't want to say more about those findings because we will be talking about those in our breakout groups. But I do want to briefly go to, for just a couple minutes, to summarize a couple of other ways you can think about doing qualitative analysis. One of those ways that we haven't talked about in these cases is something called process tracing. Now, process tracing aims to try to explain different processes along the ways, and it's very useful for implementation of policy. Because we can look at how policy gets decided, we can look at how policy gets turned into implementation, we can look at how it gets rolled out, as it did in the case 1 in Bihar session. They didn't quite look at it through a process tracing mechanism as much as a case comparison. But it helps us to explain the different mechanisms and provides evidence for how things are happening in the process. And it requires evidence from lots of different stakeholders and participants. And it primarily can use a lot of documents and artifacts, but also interviews and observations. So that's one example. And you might do some search, and there's some explanation of process tracing in the qualitative note as well that you could look at. And second, and this one we have already talked about in some sense in relation to case one, is what we call constant comparative analysis. It doesn't have to be exclusive to cases, but it's often used when we're doing comparative cases. And it's where we are constantly comparing data between, say, a group and another group. So it could be in the case, and in some cases, it was probably used a little bit with the example in case two, to kind of compare those differences between, say, different groups of stakeholders that they interviewed. But we use it to then explain not just similarities, but differences. And again, sampling here becomes really important so that we aren't just going towards a sort of biased group of sampling. You might look for maximum variation or do more iterative sampling to ensure you're getting the quality of data to confirm and to show disconfirming cases. So with that, that has given you a lot of information about different kinds of analysis. You will have the slides to return to think about them, and there are many more kinds of analysis you can look at in examples from the qualitative note and cases that are cited. But we want to return now to the breakout rooms.
So
Deborah.
we're going to move into breakout rooms. You'll have 15 minutes in these breakout rooms. You'll be looking at part 2 of the case studies, specifically about the analysis. And the goal of these is really to look at what did they do with the data and ask these questions that you see here on the slide. So you'll be looking at alignment. How did the analysis line up with the question and the design? Did it actually answer the question or only part of it? You'll be looking at comparison, what comparisons were made, and also improvement. What alternatives were considered? Was there any disconfirming evidence? What other data or analysis would you suggest to strengthen the conclusion? And so you should be ready to come back with a couple points on what seems well aligned, what might be missing, and any suggestions you have to improve the analysis. So again, 15 minutes, and we can go into breakout rooms now.
Welcome back, everyone. While we wait for the others to return from the breakout rooms, we'll just start with some posting maybe in the chat from each of the groups. There were 9 groups, I think 5 of them discussing case 1 and 4 discussing case 2. And I would like to just hear your thoughts again, say your group or your case. What was a key takeaway that you have from this case in terms of something you've learned about the alignment between purpose and question and analysis? And if you want to at the same time, you could also share in that chat maybe a concern you also had or an improvement. So please go ahead and add those to the chat. And I believe everyone is back with us. And we will discuss some of those takeaways. So just to repeat for everyone, you can add to the chat the case that you were working with and a key takeaway that you had personally. You could also summarize it for your group, but you could take personally a key takeaway or a concern or an improvement. And while you're doing that, I listened in to many of the other rooms, and so I just want to say something. I heard a key takeaway for case 1 being that maybe some use of mixed methods would be very important. I will say it was actually, we summarized the qualitative side of that study, but there was mixed methods used in that case. As I said, it was built on a randomized controlled trial initially, and then they did gather additional quantitative data, particularly to look at learning outcomes and to compare whether learning outcomes are equivalent across those cases or sustained. And then but the question was more narrow for qualitative, right? The question was to try to understand how the implementation of it might have differed if you have differing kinds of outcomes, or even if you have similar kinds of outcomes. So that was one good example from case one. Thank you for the adding to the chat. Yes, I also heard in case two. So another takeaway was that the analysis was actually broader or did more than just the initial question. Now, one could say, well, that may be a mismatch, or maybe it's that we realize as we're gathering data, sometimes we can have data that help to say, to answer more questions than we initially posed, right? So we can sort of add to our research questions. I think this was pointed out in the sense that there was initially the main purpose, right, in case two was to look at why is there resistance to comprehensive sexuality education. But one of the main findings, of course, also was that there was inadequate resources. Now, we might think that that's not a resistance, but they did have a finding related to resources that helps us understand why this might not get implemented. Further analysis actually might explore why why resources might actually be used as a reason alongside of other resistance, right? So we could take that analysis even further and look at some of those linkages between resources and other kinds of resistance. Good. Let's keep looking at examples in the chat. So in case one, there are some concerns about variables that may not be analyzed, and whether then you have sort of trustworthiness of the results. And this is a challenge with all studies, right? All studies, whether quantitative or qualitative, have limitations. And so if you set out to, in a quantitative study, to look at certain kinds of variables, you might be missing others. If you set out in a qualitative study to look at certain kinds of things, like in this case, governance, you are still gathering a lot of variety of data, but you are honing in. Remember, we talked about analysis is sort of ongoing. So as you're gathering data, you're honing in to say, well, how does this help me explain the governance, right? And not maybe just the other aspects of implementation. So any kind of research question is focused. And in that sense, it will leave out other kinds of data. And that probably leaves us with the challenge of, well, how do we need to answer questions about other kinds of conditions or factors? And if so, do we need to then do more research? And do we need to do that with more quantitative and or qualitative mixed methods kind of research? So a good example from case one of there may be other variables like socioeconomic differences across districts that were brought up in case one. That wasn't the purpose necessarily. They really wanted to understand how teachers working with the NGO and how staff and district stakeholders were supporting the implementation of that reform. So again, we become quite focused on our questions. Sometimes in qualitative research, we, especially through more ethnographic or grounded methods, we might actually change our question a little bit. If we suddenly discern that the socioeconomic variables are more important, we might follow some of that data as well, if you will. All right. All right, thank you for your takeaways. I'm just looking at lots of them related to case one. I like this example. Someone says case one, also the one improvement might be adding analysis about teacher autonomy, right? So again, if we're thinking about governance, that might be a component of our governance. And again, one of the things in doing analysis and in setting up any study is we are oriented toward, when we gather data and analyze it, we're oriented toward the things that we have conceptualized as important, right? So what does governance mean in this case? And they're trying to understand that through talking with the administrators, the district stakeholders, the school stakeholders, and trying to understand how they describe their roles and responsibilities. But we might have other conceptions of governance. And in this case, autonomy might be a critical one. And it may not have figured into our original sort of hypotheses or assumptions. So that's another thing to think about is, are we surfacing other kinds of concepts or themes that actually are important to consider, but weren't initially in our questions or even in our conceptual framework. And qualitative data can do that. Remember, I told you the story at the very beginning yesterday of how all that analysis from quantitative studies of PISA data, household surveys, et cetera, couldn't surface certain kinds of factors that affected learning outcomes. But if you use qualitative data, you might actually reveal some new concepts or new ideas. And what we revealed in some cases was some of the more micro practices of teaching in the classroom, including things like helping metacognitive learning that teachers help students with. And that wasn't easily picked up in the surveys and all of that research data over years. So again, we can add our concepts, add new concepts from qualitative research, and then add new questions and maybe analysis. Yeah. Some of you note that case one is complicated. It is a very in-depth, complicated study. And then you have to think about that also in terms of resources. What's the amount of time needed for a study? What's the resources needed to do that kind of study? Which we've talked a little bit about. All right. Deborah, I just want to see if there's anything more you want to add here from questions, because you've been able to probably look through some of the comments in the chat, things that you might want to alert us to as we finish summing up for this discussion on these cases.
Yeah, I think there's some of these questions we'll be able to answer moving forward. One question I did want to just surface was, it came up in my group, it came up in the chat, was just about how different socioeconomic factors, regional disparities can affect findings, and how that is integrated in terms of being able to think about the analysis and the findings of qualitative research when you have those big discrepancies.
Yeah, good example. And I'm also seeing in the chat, and we can move to the next slide because it kind of relates to ways to think about other alternatives to doing analysis. But there's an example here around case two, a concern that researchers themselves may have bias, right? We bring our biases to the work, and this affects everything from the way we ask a question to how we analyze the data. That said, in case two, I think it was really important that they used a second researcher to analyze the data and come up with some ways that they shared understandings around the kind of conclusions they were drawing from the statements from the interviewees, because that allows you then to check some of those biases. So that is a way of increasing trustworthiness. And we've been talking about that in terms of, we've been talking on this slide, we've been talking about the way we can use mixed methods, right, to integrate our qualitative data with our quant, not only, as Nisa pointed out in the beginning today, to necessarily support our quantitative, but to actually sometimes offer new findings, as we've been saying, or to elucidate things that our quantitative cannot. And to ensure, of course, as we've been talking about, sometimes checking triangulation is not just about putting one set of data against another set of data, but it's actually checking those inferences against each other. So you might see, for example, like one group saying Let me tell you about a study, a good example of this is one of the first studies that I ever did working with the Ministry of Education was an all qualitative study. And one of the questions that came out in that, so we were collecting qualitative data about why children did not continue on to secondary school for certain groups in the country. And we had interviewed parents, teachers, and students. And one of the questions that came out during that analysis, and this was more than 20 years ago, was, well, what about if the parents or if the teachers say something different than the students, who should we listen to? Right? There is that challenge when we have data from different stakeholders. And in this case, I felt like theoretically there was a reason to foreground some of the statements from students and their families, because sometimes teachers themselves also have biases about why students aren't going to school. And I think someone else gave an example earlier that to understand kind of dropout or being pushed out of school really does require the perspectives of families and children themselves. So this is where we need to be able to check inferences that we're drawing from those different kinds of methods. I will say, I tell you that story a little bit because it was a study that directly influenced policy right after we completed it. And that was a study designed, as I said, 20 years ago to be only qualitative at the time. It did not actually rest on any prior quantitative findings because they didn't really have the ways of understanding for these different groups in their communities about why they were leaving secondary school. And it also helps us to identify, when we do qualitative data or mixed methods, to identify contradictory findings. And just because they're contradictory, as I said, between, say, teachers and students, doesn't mean we dismiss them. We actually seek to further explain them. Why would teachers be saying one thing and students another? Right? And with that further explanation, it might lead us to richer kinds of implications for policy. So I just want to offer that there are many ways that we can combine qualitative research with quantitative through mixed methods, and improve the sort of trustworthiness of the data we are collecting. With that, I think we're going to move along to our next section on how we might apply findings to decisions. And if there's anything more you want to add there, Deborah, please feel free.
Sure. Yeah, so let's transition now to talking about analysis, to now talking about actually using findings and applying them in real decisions. So we're going to think again about our case studies, and in the chat, or if you want to come off of mute and speak, that would be great as well. We want to think about the questions that are here on the slide. How could the findings from your case study be used in making real decisions? And at what level are you talking about? Are you talking about a state or national policy? Are you talking about district management? Are you talking about school practice or community at the community level? So if you just list out which case study you're talking about, and then what are some of the uses that you see for the findings from your case study?
Sorry, just a short technical message. If any participants wants to speak, just raise your hand and we'll allow you to unmute.
Thank you. Okay, so Shanara is saying, looking at the question is what type of study is usually cheaper about cost for quantitative or qualitative. We can come back to that. So yeah, we have a few questions coming in the chat here that we can look at. Any responses to the ways in which we could use findings? Okay, Nada says that yeah, findings could be compared to already existing findings, absolutely, to be able to make needed implementations for curriculum changes. Other thoughts? Yeah, so what kinds of recommendations might you make, or how might you think about how this could be used to advise a ministry. So yes, decision making at the district government level, what they should prioritize, how leadership could be strengthened. Yes. At the frontline administrator level, they could be encouraged or motivated to focus on academic mentoring. Absolutely. Yes, the one of the main findings in case study 1 was that the academic, the administrators were just sort of box ticking in their observations, and that so one finding could absolutely be that, or one recommendation, one use could be thinking about how to move those exercises beyond just box ticking so that they were actually doing academic mentoring. Absolutely. Informing policymakers about some of the communications implications of with the case study 2 about sexuality education and how to address community concerns. Absolutely. Thinking about teaching methods, thinking about policymakers, thinking about the resource allocation. These are great. Looking at governance networks to understand kind of the flow and power that might be. I think a lot of findings always yield more questions. So yes, there's potentially more data that could be gathered or other questions that could be asked here. Could support policy and strategic planning, like regional planning, to better think about the rollout of this program. Yes. These are all great.
Deborah, sorry to interrupt.
Yes.
Just to highlight that we have 2 participants with their hands
Perfect.
raised.
Thank you for flagging that. Asma? Do you want to come off of mute and share?
نعم. بالنسبة أيوة
Yes.
بالنسبة لمتخذين القرار
Regarding the decision makers,
تسمعني؟
can you hear me?
أسماء ممكن من فضلك تكوني على القناة العربية عشان
بالنسبة
تقدري
لمتخذ
تتكلمي.
القرار يعني أحيانا مما
So it's
يشرح
related to the
من
decision
البداية
makers.
في
Sometimes
الفكرة
when they are
الأساسية
involved from the
لعمل
beginning
الدراسة
in
الفنية
the main
فبيفاجأ
qualitative study,
بالنتائج
or in
فهو
fact,
لو ما
when they
كان
are not involved, they are surprised.
فما النتيجة المقبولة
They should be
وأحيانا
involved from the beginning.
بتبقى
And sometimes
النتائج اللي استخلصت لها الدراسات دي حبيسة الأدراج.
the outcomes of these studies remain in the drawers, so they remain hidden and not
Hello?
published. Apparently, she's having some trouble with her connection.
Thank you for that, Asma. Will we get a translation?
أستاذة رشا
ايوه اسمع انا معاكي بس انت على القناه المفروض تكوني على القناه العربيه عشان المترجمين يسمعوكي.
Asma, you should be on the Arabic channel, Rasha is telling her, so that we could hear you better.
Deborah and John, could you hear the
حبيسة
interpretation?
الأدراج وما بالذات للتطريف الجنسي في حالة حملات بيئة
So she's saying
وهكذا.
that the study sometimes remains in the drawers and is not published. This is the problem.
Could you hear it now? Are you in the
No.
English channel?
yeah.
Or
Can
is
you
it-
hear me? Can you hear the English
I
translation?
actually don't have the
Yeah,
option.
you will need to go to the English channel.
Yes.
So in the globe interpretation, select English.
At the
I
bottom
was also
of
not
the
there,
screen.
so that's
Now
really
it's
why.
there. Yes, thank you.
So
Can you hear me now?
yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so she was basically saying
Tell me
that
ask
decision
the
makers
question
should
to
be
be
involved from the
asked
beginning.
again. I think that's
Okay.
really
ممكن تقولي السؤال تاني؟
Yes. So in saying that decision makers should be involved from the beginning, absolutely. That is one of the main points we're actually going to make you. That was a great transition into our next section and thinking about applying the points that we're going to make on the next slide about the importance of uptake and use of findings being directly related to who's been involved throughout the process. So yes, absolutely.
She was also saying that sometimes the results and the outcomes of the study remain in the drawers and they are never published. This is her idea. Okay.
Yes. And we want to avoid that. We all know many cases where that has happened. And then Rahila.
Hello.
Yes.
I just want to comment on this question and also a question on my question. Actually, the problem is that in the second case, where we have just focus on the Islamabad, like one capital city, is it possible that we can recommend our policymaker on the basis of only on the one context? Like Pakistan is a big country, so we cannot generalize, one context to the other. So the policy is for the whole country. So can we, recommend on the basis of one context, like in Islamabad? Thank you.
I would generally say no, but I'm gonna let Joan answer that.
Well, I would say that policy can happen at different levels. And yes, while we might think of national policy, there are, like in the case of India, state policies, right? So that's why Bihar was implementing this kind of program that may not have been implemented in other states. My understanding is in Pakistan too, you actually do have more localized policy making that does happen. So I think that's why we asked at what level too, right? Because not all of it will be brought to a national or legislature. Someone suggested bringing it into law. Yes, depending on the nature of the findings and depending on the level.
Great. And then let's just take one more question from Gembo or comment.
Thank
Yes,
you.
Gembo.
It's not really a question. I was thinking of responding to this one, applying findings to decisions. We can use our knowledge of scaling strategies to turn the research findings into policy decisions. So
yes,
I don't know how this
absolutely.
sounds. So we can identify champions relating to our research findings, and then talk with the champions, engage with the champions, and then that will in fact provide us with rich areas where our findings can possibly turn into policy decisions. Because as researchers, usually there is a disconnect. The researchers don't have the opportunities to actually implement what they find. So it is the other party, that's the other stakeholders, including policy makers, whether to take up the findings from the research or not. So for that, I think the important strategy is that the scaling strategies come up as the best fit for this. Thank you.
Thank you. And related to the last comment too, not only is involving stakeholders really important for getting good data and also for use and uptake of decisions, but even, as you said, identifying champions or others who might be involved in the whole process of uptake and use. So I know there are lots of comments in the chat. I encourage you to read all of those. We just don't have the time to, unfortunately, go over all of them now. I am going to just give you a few kind of pointers or really they're questions, key questions that you'll want to ask yourself when you're thinking about using qualitative research for decision making and really thinking about that uptake piece. So first, is thinking about the scope and the level. This has been a theme throughout the last 2 days. What level does this study speak to? And it may speak to multiple levels, right? Is it about national policy? Is it about district implementation? Is it at the school level, community level? But being really clear about where the implications and the findings hit. Second is which findings are actually decision relevant, because qualitative studies can produce a lot of information, but we need to pull out the findings that actually change what you would do. Third is, how does this fit with other evidence? So again, another theme throughout the last 2 days has been around triangulation. So qualitative findings are often most powerful. Most research is most powerful when it's combined with other findings. Those could be other quantitative or qualitative data, but that really strengthens the case for action when you're able to triangulate. And then fourth is, what else do you need to know before acting? Do you need to know more about feasibility, acceptability, equity implications, right? Because that often determines whether or not the findings are able to be implemented or work in the real world. So lots of great thoughts here. Keep them coming if you have any other thoughts about what are other key factors or key questions that you should ask yourself when you're thinking about using qualitative research for decision making. But we wanted to make sure that you also have we have plenty of time for questions. So we wanted to open it up for questions now. And we're happy again for folks to come off of mute if you raise your hand, or to write questions into the chat. I know we've had a few different questions here. One that I will pose to you, Joan, that came up earlier in the chat was about uncomfortable truths and qualitative research, surfacing those, and how you're able to help deliver or promote the use of those findings when people don't necessarily want to hear them.
Yeah, good question. And I think that can be the case for all research. Sometimes research can uncover uncomfortable truths, qualitative maybe even more so, because it's less circumscribed by the kinds of knowledge that we know before we gather data. Excuse me. I think that many of the ideas for addressing uncomfortable truths to bring them to policymakers has already been suggested by some of you in the chat, right? And thinking about, how do you already get stakeholders involved early on to be committed to a study? How do you help engage in dialogue when you're delivering the findings between people who might be champions of the findings and those uncomfortable truths, and others who might be denying, right? Of course, power comes out in those examples. Again, this was not a study I was involved in, but in a context I've worked a lot. There's been a study that has tried to show the effects of teachers tutoring outside of class time on students. And those effects were not positive necessarily. We assume sometimes that it actually can increase learning outcomes. In this case, it didn't make a whole lot of difference. And of course, government policymakers did not want to reveal that study, right? So there are some places where our studies may not make the light of day. They may not be published by the policymakers in power at that time, but that's where getting some of the studies out in different media can be useful, right? So it's whether it's working with other researchers in institutions who can remember this and maybe follow up on those studies at a later point when those people in power are not the same people, or getting it out through social media forms. In some places that serves as a form of civic advocacy, and I know some of you work in organizations around civic advocacy for education. So there can be different ways, I think, to try to share uncomfortable truths. I think one of the things that, we all know change is long-term, right? There can be some rapid and sudden changes in policy that can occur from some studies, but But it really is a long-term thing. And I think qualitative research is prepared for that. We often think about things like randomized controlled trials as being, a way to say we definitively can show change and then it somehow immediately has an impact. But that also doesn't always hold, right? And so I think don't lose faith in qualitative research to be able to show some of those uncomfortable truths, even if it doesn't make change right away, because it's about getting the knowledge out there in places where it might eventually make that change.
That's great. Another question from Nasir is about how are instruments made more reliable in qualitative studies?
Yeah, so often the researcher is part of the instrument, right? And when we talk about instruments, it's not a tool out there. And there can be, I just want to be clear, there can be unreliability in instruments too, or maybe lack of validity really in instruments that are quantitative. We might see them as highly reliable, but they can always also be assessing the wrong thing when we're talking about quantitative surveys. And so I want to be certain that we're not always saying, well, one is always more reliable or valid than another. And how do we make it? Then we will return to this at the very end too. But one of the important aspects is about sort of the training that we have for the researchers that are involved, right? And how we work with multiple researchers to ensure a more robust design that goes all the way from the questions we ask to the points some of you are making, which is about asking questions that include relevant stakeholders in that process so that those questions are good questions relevant to the context, all the way to the analysis. And as we talked about, for example, in the case study 2, using multiple researchers to code data, bringing those, having participants involved in coding, right? And making sense of the analysis. All of that can actually ensure that our instrument, which is the people involved in the research process, are actually more rigorous in the decisions they make.
Okay. Then there's another question about the validity of findings, generalizing to the larger population, and how you use sampling or other techniques to do that in qualitative research.
So as we've said, qualitative research's aim, we should not use, for example, quantitative research and qualitative research start with different assumptions. And one of the aims of some quantitative research, though not all that's done, is to be more generalizable by randomly sampling from a population. Now, I've seen many quantitative studies, though, that don't do that well. And some do it very well. So the aim in qualitative is not to actually generalize necessarily to the population. Of course, when we think about national policy, then the question always becomes, well, how can we use selected cases to speak to national policy? And my work with national policymakers in some contexts has been to twofold. One, to actually work on larger teams where we use mixed methods so that you can bring in more data that is representative, as well as data that also shows some of the nuances in cases. And the second is when you work on cases that are not necessarily representative of the whole country, you also show the variation in how they have to implement a policy. Now, policymakers don't always like that, right? But if they think about how policy gets rolled out and acted, they understand well, too, that it's not just about making a policy that is generalizable. They understand that it takes many, many actors in order to make that policy happen. So if you can use your cases to show the variation, positive ones, but also challenges, right, in how a policy is being implemented and enacted, then that also has a lot of power to improve the actual policy as it's being implemented. So let's be careful not to use the same kinds of assumptions for quantitative analysis as we do for qualitative, but let's use the strengths of both of them to actually improve what we're doing in policy or practice.
Thank you. That's very helpful. One more question, and then I know we have some additional content to cover. I know there's a lot of emphasis on time and the time that it takes to do studies. And so I know there are a lot of questions around how do we do qualitative research more rapidly?
Yeah. And I think there's also a related question I could bring in that was kind of related to cost too, right? Like which is more expensive, or what kinds of costs are associated with quant and qual. And as I said, I will not be definitive about this, but I've worked with a number of research studies that have been mixed methods. And while we should not underestimate the cost of qualitative, because I think sometimes we do. We underestimate it probably in terms of the analysis. We also underestimate the time needed for analysis. So we can be rapid often in data collection, but actually both quantitative and qualitative take a lot of time in analysis. And some can be more rapid now, especially with the use of AI tools. But of course, that really requires a lot of checking in both quantitative or qualitative analysis. But do not underestimate the cost that's needed for both. I will say in most cases that I've worked on, the cost of the quantitative is often actually much more than the qualitative. And part of that relates to scope, right? If you are doing a randomized control trial, the cost is often quite high, especially with more nationally representative sampling. And usually the studies I've been on, the qualitative has been almost a third of the budget as a quantitative. Now, that doesn't mean that that's always accurate. That doesn't mean we can do all the analysis we need to do with that kind of budget. Similarly with quantitative, there's probably much more analysis that is needed or could be done depending on the budget we give. So I would say when you're thinking about time, don't just think about the rapidness of the time in gathering the data. That actually, as we talked earlier, could be sped up through different methods that are used. But think about the time needed for analysis and actually reporting out and using that data. And again, AI can help in some of that analysis and shortening up the time for that. But I have not worked yet on a lot of studies using AI to actually analyze my data. AI is used a lot you might use it to actually transcribe a lot of data, right? You can do all of that very quickly. With analysis, you might be able to use it, but I would also be clear that you check that analysis. Because what it's probably good at is a lot of content analysis. We talked about doing content analysis as almost a preliminary step in qualitative analysis. And there may be ways to then run AI tools to actually do some other kinds of analysis, like network analysis that we talked about, or process tracing might be another one.
So I'll just mention here that BE Squared is running we're launching a new paper on AI and education evidence synthesis next week. It's not specific to qualitative data at all, but I will drop a link to that in the chat if you're interested in registering for it in just a minute here. But let's go ahead and move on. I know there are a few other slides we want to cover here, Joan.
Yeah, so I just want to kind of summarize some common mistakes or challenges in doing qualitative research. And one is, as we've talked throughout the last 2 days, an over-reliance on a single method, right? You did see that in case 2, and I purposely chose one that kind of just used a singular method. But I think you also saw ways that that method and the data from it were coded in multiple ways to actually try to improve trustworthiness, and where you all suggested additional methods that could be used to actually add to sort of the verifiability of the data, right? So think about using multiple methods. Sometimes there's an overemphasis on number of participants. Oh, that wasn't enough participants, right? And again, it depends on what our purpose is and what level by which we're trying to use those findings. If we're trying to use those findings to inform national policy, qualitative, it has a hard time being representative all the way across. So a mixed method study is better. But if we're really trying to focus in on a particular subset of questions around how, say, a policy is being rolled out, the governance of it, et cetera, then we want to be honing in on the participants that are necessary to answer that question. We have to be careful not to treat coding as the analysis, right? Coding is only one step. So we might get the data, we might do some content coding, we might do some relational coding, other kinds of coding, but analysis goes beyond that. And I think the example in case 2, as well as case 1, where they use the different methods to try to show how they came to a narrative around how governance is happening. In case 2, where they used the content coding and then the network analysis to try and come to a richer analysis. Another is do not expect software to do the analysis for you. We can use AI and we can use lots of in vivo, MaxQDA and other software to automatically do a lot of quick finding of particular concepts and codes. But that isn't the analysis overall. Other important point when we talk about kind of confirmability of findings or trustworthiness is really creating what we call a strong audit trail of our data, showing transparency in our data and our descriptions of the data. That was hard to do in a case summary because we were trying to give you a summary of things, and that would have to, the audit trails would have to be through showing much more rich data. Another is to make sure that we triangulate our inferences across sources and methods, and we talked about that. And a mistake that's used is we don't always seek out disconfirming, or we don't look for alternative explanations. We come up with an explanation. Oh, we found an answer. This is what's explaining this case, and we don't always seek out that other evidence. And that starts earlier on with actually seeking out additional sampling sometimes, right? We may sample a whole bunch of principals and teachers and confirm an idea, but we may have missed another set, right, of respondents. So, and we put pages here for some of these that are from the qualitative note for you to kind of go back and refer to some of these common challenges and mistakes. All right, we want to say a few words about software because this is a question, and there have been many questions about AI as well. Again, software is, I think, really helpful to manage large data sets. On all my projects, I do use software. It not only manages it across multiple researchers, but it also then manages it over time. And you, of course, can return to it. It allows you to retrieve and access your data very easily. And it can accommodate many different sizes of projects. And as I said, multiple researchers at once. If you use in vivo or MaxQDA, it allows for multiple researchers to code all simultaneously. And it can integrate across platforms. You can integrate quantitative data into your MaxQDA and in vivo. You can likely use AI in various ways in that, although sometimes with AI, you may want to actually create your own sort of codes, just as you would with quantitative data. To be able to run certain kinds of models that you are, or certain kinds of questions you're looking for. Next slide. We just want to remind you that software, of course, helps to organize and extract, but it does not analyze for you, right? You decide on codes, you look at the data and analyze it for the kind of themes and how they're relating to each other, as the network analysis did in case 2. And that you need to be thinking about data management early, right? Who's involved in managing that data? You know, when I was running a very large qualitative study several years ago now, I had a large team and they had to immediately upload the data to be stored so that data wasn't lost. You had to immediately make sure that all data was coded appropriately with attributes given to it appropriately in the files. So all of those processes have to be thought through early on when you're actually going out to gather data.
Joan, I'm just going to interrupt with a quick question that's in the chat. Shaima asks, does the software help with the actual interpretation of the data, or is the main role just for organizing and coding?
The main role really is for organizing and coding, but software does a lot more things these days too, right? So when you use MaxQDA or in vivo, you can actually also put in sort of almost your conceptual framework and try to look at that conceptual framework in relation to the data. So it does a lot of mapping for you, if you will, of your data, visual mapping, and create different kinds of visuals for you. And that can be really, really helpful. So that's helpful in the interpretation process, right? but you are the instrument in this process as well, or you have multiple researchers as instruments to help ensure the trustworthiness of the data, as I said. So there are, I wouldn't say that it does no interpretation. You can't automatically just ask it to interpret for you. But when you give it your sort of theories of change, your conceptual frameworks, and you help look at that alongside your data, it can show visuals and other data sources that help provide that interpretation. Good. And then this last slide does just give you some links to some common software. We didn't include in here MaxQDA, but these others are in vivo, Atlas. And there's many training materials that are used alongside them, video training materials for all the different pieces of these software. I think with that, we want to sort of just wrap up and bring this together and remind you what we have covered over the last 2 days in two very short sessions, 4 hours. So I think someone has a tool that they're able to use. So on the slide. So we started with, and we have talked all the way along about how we link purpose with our context and assumptions to shape our questions and our methodology. So we're thinking about the levels, when we say context, the level at which we're working and asking these questions, which could be at the school level or a district level. You could be thinking nationally, but you're likely then more tied to a mixed methods study. But all of these choices around purpose and context influence the methods and sampling that you're doing, and of course, the analysis you do. Again, what we haven't talked as much about, but you can see a little bit through some of our conversations, it's really critical to think about the selection of researchers and including your local staff and local stakeholders in the research process, right? Whether that's young people as youth researchers, whether that's policymakers as researchers along the way, whether that's parents or teachers, all of them could provide both insights in the early design and research questions to the analysis of the data. And then, of course, the take-up as we're talking about the use of those. But you do need to ensure that there's competencies to do this kind of research, right? I work with many teams who have been really good at going out and gathering data, and sometimes it's survey data, and then trying to actually help them understand how do you do this in a more qualitative way, right? Whether it's interviews or arts-based methods, all of those require a certain amount of training and practice to be feeling competent when you go out there to do that. So think about the training that's needed. And of course, we need to be planning for all the ethical processes along the way. That includes like who's involved in asking the questions, right? To getting our ethical clearances, to the data management we talked about, and all of the processes of dissemination of the findings. So that does help us think through, I think, the timeline, the questions of like, how much time is needed when we do a study? And we can talk about timeline for, as we said, gathering a data, but there's a different sort of timeline for analyzing and also for disseminating that needs to be taken up. Sometimes some things can be more rapid. I've worked on a study in a couple of states in India where we were quickly trying to analyze qualitative findings to get it out there for dissemination very quickly. And then we actually took a little more time to actually be more thorough in a much larger report. But so you can think about different kinds of ways that findings are summarized and disseminated as well in that process. And with that, I think we are wrapped up with all of your wonderful suggestions, contributions, and findings, and we want to turn to a closing reflection. Thank you.
Yeah, so we have had a whirlwind tour through this whole process of qualitative research production and use. We've answered some of your questions. As we've said, we'll follow up to answer more of them in a note afterwards. We've had some time to practice application with the case studies, but now we want to take just a few final moments to make sure that you can apply what you've learned in the last 2 days to your own work and your own context. Research has shown that people are more likely to retain what they've learned if they apply it very quickly. So we're going to give you an opportunity to do that. So what we'd like you to do now is just take 2 quiet minutes to write down one concrete action that you will take in your own context based on what we've learned over the last 2 days. That could be based on what's on the screen in terms of thinking about a new qualitative study and how you might apply and think about design choices, about the analysis, about making decisions. It could also be thinking about research that you're already doing and how you might apply that or do it differently. You might be thinking about how you would like to apply qualitative research findings. So we'll give you 2 minutes right now just to think for a moment about how you would like to apply what you've learned in your context. So then we'd like you, as you think of these things, the most important thing is for you to write down for yourself. We hope this will be a commitment to yourself to then use what you've learned, hopefully soon in the next 30 days. But we'd also like you to share in the chat those reflections or your commitment to yourself. It would be really great to see how you plan on using this. And we're going to have a survey at the end here where you'll also have a chance to capture a bit of that. So I see several people thinking about new studies. That's great. Or thinking about that within their organization, your university, or your agency. Yeah,
I see a
so
few examples showing how they'll rethink the things that they might do in current studies, which is also important. You can make changes in the middle of a study. You, of course, want to keep alignment, but you can make changes.
yes, and I see a few folks talking too about a plan around how to use and make decisions around some of the qualitative data that they have. This is great. Rethink your research proposal. Reviewing TORs for experts. That's great. Being more careful in general when you're planning these studies, and hopefully you can use the resources that we're providing to come back to reorient you when you're doing that as well. This is fantastic. We would love to hear from you too in the future to find out if this has been helpful and you're really benefiting from this training. We would love to hear from you, even if it's months into the future. We would love to hear how you're using and applying all of this. So I think with that, we can hand it over. Before I do that, I just want to say a big thank you. Thank you, first of all, to all of you as participants for the energy, your engagement, your great questions, your great thinking. This was a commitment on your part, and we really hope that it's been useful for you now and in the future. Huge thanks to Joan for leading the technical content. Obviously, Joan is amazing. Thanks to the KIX team for organizing and convening all of this, to the BE² team and the KIX team staff that were behind the scenes producing and supporting all of this in the breakout rooms and transitions. Yeah, we hope you leave here not just with concepts, but with concrete actions that you'll apply in your work. So thank you very much, and over to the KIX team now.
Thank you, Deborah. And you were thinking exactly on the same point as we were in terms of thanking the participants. This was your workshop. And thank you so much for sharing your experiences, being so open to ask questions, sharing your comments, your thoughts. It really enriched our today's workshop. Thanks to the Building Events and Education team, Deborah, Joan, Maria, Amelia, and Marian. It is wonderful to collaborate with you from the design to the implementation, and then reading also what the participants will tell us in terms of how we will continue the knowledge exploration on this topic as well. Thanks to the KIX EMAP team. So everyone who has a background like the one I have here, this includes Marina, Alison, Yasmina, but also knowledge leads that were here today from the different sub-regions. Rasha Sharaf from South Asia, Middle East, and North Africa. Aditi Desai from Southeast Asia country supports, and Janil Bonkumbaeva, who is supporting us for Europe and Central Asia. As always, we can always do better. We also do not do everything well. So we will now screen share QR codes for you to tell us your thoughts on how we can improve and how we can continue to respond to your demands. So there will be soon a QR code here in the screen. And not only how we did and what you like, what you did not like so much, but also how would you like us to continue this knowledge exploration? And if you feel that the hub has a role in terms of continuing in promoting some of the conversation that was started here, and if the hub can create any platforms you think might be useful for you to continue some of the conversations with your peers in other countries. So we welcome you to fill in the survey. The survey will also follow by email, as will all of the resources of the workshop. And this activity is just one of the many activities that the hub is offering. And the hub work continues. And we have currently opened 2 applications for our 2 new learning cycles. We also have a QR code here that you can scan and get more information. Applications are open until the end of the day this Sunday. So 2 learning cycles, one on education and climate change, and another one on AI and education. So we welcome your support with mobilizing and sharing these application forms, and also for you to apply if you think this is relevant for your work. In all of this, thank you so much for everyone for such a wonderful workshop. We'll see each other all soon again. Thank you, everyone.